In this lecture, we will loop over an array using the forEach method. Now, we had already learned how to loop over an array using the forOff loop, but the forEach method is really fundamentally different. And from now on, we will start working with our bank account data, but still in a very simplified way. So let me get this data here into the present lecture so that we can see what we're actually working with. So let me comment it out from here and just move it here. So let's say that we wanted to loop over this movements array in order to print a message for each movement in this bank account. So these positive values here are basically deposits and the negative values are withdrawals. And so we can print something to the console saying whether the user deposited or withdrew some money. And let's actually start by doing this using a forOff loop, just so that we can then compare the forEach loop to this one. So let's create a variable movement of movements, and then we will log something to the console according to the movement value. So basically, if the current movement is greater than 0, then log to the console you deposited and then the movement, and else you withdrew and then the movement again. And actually we can use a nice math function here, which is to take the absolute value. So basically removing the sign. So let's see. And yeah, that looks nice. So of course this solution here works perfect. But now let's finally learn how to use the forEach method to achieve the exact same thing, but in my opinion, in an easier way. So to loop over the movements array, we use forEach, and that's with a capital E, don't forget that. And then the forEach method actually requires a callback function here. So forEach is technically a higher order function, as we learned in the last section, which requires a callback function in order to tell it what to do. So it's the forEach method here that will call this callback function. We are not calling it ourselves, as always. And that's, of course, important to keep in mind once again. But when exactly will forEach actually call this callback function? Well, what the forEach method does is to loop over the array, and in each iteration, it will execute this callback function here. Also, as the forEach method calls this callback function in each iteration, it will pass in the current element of the array as an argument. And so we can specify that here. And let's call it again movement. So again, each time this callback here is called, so in each iteration, it will receive the current element of the array as an argument. And here we can, of course, give this any name that we want, but I'm just calling it movement because that's what we did up here. And so now we can do exactly the same thing here in this callback function. Let's give it a save. And indeed, we now get the same result twice. So let me just add like a separator here for each. And so, yeah, indeed, we get the same result. Can also get ourselves more space. And yeah, so that's essentially how the forEach method works. So basically behind the scenes, in iteration 0, it will call this function here. So an anonymous function in this case without a name. But let's just call it function. And it's going to call it with the value of 200. Then in the next iteration, it will call it with the value of 450, then with the value of 400, right? And so on and so forth until it reaches the end of the array. And this part of the forEach function passing in the current element of the array, here like this, this, and this, is especially important to understand. So basically, this is exactly the concept that I explained in the last section when I said that we use a callback function to tell another higher order function exactly what it should do. And so in this case, we tell forEach that in each iteration, it should log one of these two strings here to the console. So we give the forEach method instructions by giving it a callback function which contains these instructions. All right? And I really know and understand that this is quite a hard concept to wrap your head around. But if you just continue using this from now on, then eventually it will start to make sense, believe me. Now, anyway, which of the two versions do you think is cleaner and easier to write and easier to read? Well, I think that we can both agree that it is the forEach method, right? And maybe you don't agree with that. And of course, that's okay. As I keep mentioning, it's always good to develop your own style of programming. But using the forEach method here, and especially understanding the logic behind it here with the callback function, is still really important for all the other methods that we're going to learn later. Anyway, let's now learn some more stuff about the forEach method, because we are not done yet. So what if we actually needed access to a counter variable here? So just like we can access the current index of the array here in the forOff loop. So remember how we did that with forOff. So let's just rewrite this part. So in this case, we loop over movements.entries, remember? So entries is in fact just another array method, and it returns an array of arrays, remember, which in the first position contains the current index and then the value itself. And so this is how we access the counter variable in the forOff loop. And then here in our string, we could use that to say, for example, movement, and then the number of the movement. So that's the counter which starts at 0. And so we just add 1 to that. And so, well, something went wrong. So that's in line 1 to 1. So unexpected token. Oh, and that's because we didn't open it here again. So we were missing this part here. And now this looks a lot nicer with the number of the movement here. And so let's now do the same in the forEach method here. And here, fortunately, it's a lot easier to get access to the current index. So to understand how it works, we need to remember once more that it is the forEach method who calls this callback function in each iteration. And as it calls this function, it also passes in the current element of the array. But actually, that's not all it passes in. In fact, forEach passes in the current element, the index, and the entire array that we are looping. And so, therefore, we can specify them here in our parameter list. So let's say index and array. Now, of course, we can just use one like we have been doing, or we can just use two, or we can use all three together. And as always, the names here do not matter at all, but what does matter is the order. So the first parameter always needs to be the current element, the second parameter always the current index, and the third one always the entire array that we are looping over. Because that's the order in which the arguments, so the actual values, are passed into our callback function. Okay, And so now let's just copy this here so we can do the same here. Give it a save. And here we called it index and not I. And in fact, in the real world, we actually use shorter names. So let's just call this one I, this one R, and this one here MOV, which is just a shorter abbreviation of movements. And so this is quite a common pattern to just abbreviate a little bit. So let's replace these three here with MOV. Give it a save. And now it does look the same as with the forOff method. But I hope you can see that it's a lot easier to get the current index here in forEach. Just notice that the order of the parameters is different in both these scenarios. So in forEach, the first value here is the current element and the second one is the index. While when we use here the entries in the forOff loop, then the first element is the index and the second value is the current array element. So just don't forget that here in this case. So always first the current element and then the index. Okay, and this is how we loop over arrays with the forEach method. Now, when should you use forEach and when should you use the forOff loop? Well, one fundamental difference between the two of them is that you cannot break out of a forEach loop. So the continue and break statements do not work in a forEach loop at all. So instead, forEach will always loop over the entire array and there is nothing that you can do about it. So if you really need to break out of a loop, then you have to keep using the forOff loop. But other than that, it really comes down to your personal preference, just like so many other things in JavaScript. So every programming language always has many different ways or different tools to achieve the same thing. And especially as more things keep getting added to the language, there will always be more options to achieve the same result. All right, and with this, we wrap up this lecture. So in my opinion, this is a really brilliant and powerful mechanism, but I know that it's also rather complex to wrap your head around this, isn't it? And it actually took quite some time for me to fully understand this myself. So back in the day. So please don't become frustrated with this. It will all become obvious with the practice. So just keep using this and then you will be fine. Once you do understand exactly how this works, so especially this mechanism of the callback and of the passing arguments into this callback here, so once you understand this fundamental mechanism, then working with all other array methods in this section will become really easy, because most of them follow the exact same principle of the callback function that we just explored here. So please review this lecture carefully, and yeah, if you really understand the role of the callback function here, then just move on to the next video. See you there.